In this video, we're going to talk about something called religious syncretism, or cultural hybridity, or transculturation. We'll talk about what distinctions there are, if any, between those various terms. But we're going to focus on those things by talking about El Día de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead. I chose to place this discussion here in the term because the Day of the Dead is coming up very soon. It's usually observed on and around November 1st and 2nd, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So you may wonder why I'm beginning a Day of the Dead presentation with a photograph of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco is a site in Mexico City. It was in the colonial era independent of Mexico City. And I visited there in 2012 when I was doing some research for my dissertation. So this photo comes from that trip. What I wanted to show you here was the way in which Spanish colonial agents, especially those of the church, literally built right on top of indigenous structures when they colonized Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, which has become Mexico City today. So you can see that in this image. There are the ruins of pyramids from Tlatelolco with a colonial church constructed right on top of that. Behind the church is actually the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, where the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968 occurred. So there's a lot of history in this particular site. But we're going to talk today then about the ways in which cultures mixed and mingled to create something unique in Latin America. Los Días de los Muertos is particularly a Mexican tradition, although there is some evidence that it was celebrated in other places as well. Some places in Peru, for example, have similar traditions to those that are observed in Mexico for Los Días de los Muertos. Something we want to start with then is Dia de los Muertos is not Mexican Halloween. Virtually any article that you read on Dia de los Muertos will tell you that. It's kind of the starting point. Because many Americans, and the tradition is celebrated widely among Mexican-American populations, and so it's become well known here in the United States, many Americans interpret it to be, oh yeah, that's Mexico's Halloween. Not really. And we'll talk more about that. Because of that reality, I want to also talk a little bit about cultural appropriation, which we could see as a form of contemporary or present-day colonization, colonialism. And then we're going to think about how Dia de los Muertos traditions have changed over time and what that shows us about the process of religious mixing or religious syncretism in Mexico and Latin America more broadly. This is one of those slides that if you go and access the slides themselves through the other link, you can go to a few different links. This has 3 different YouTube videos. If you click this large, I know this is in Spanish, but it was a really good image, and I wanted to use it anyway. I know my head's over the top of it, but you can see it in more detail. You can click here and go to a presentation from the National Hispanic Cultural Center on Dia de los Muertos. There are several events taking place there that I'll have links to in other places throughout this presentation, so that if you want to participate in those, you can. And if you haven't been to the National Hispanic Cultural Center, it's down on kind of the spot where Bridge becomes Avenida Cesar Chavez, just to the east of the river. It's an excellent place in terms of being a museum. It also has an archive for genealogical research and historical research as well, and they have a lot of cultural activities that take place there, as well as historical presentations. So I definitely recommend checking that out. These other 2 provide links to the videos that you hopefully have already watched before starting this one. So those are the I think, pretty touching video to show kind of the spirit of Dia de los Muertos and its purpose. It's not meant to be something macabre or grotesque, but it's meant to be something that connects us to our ancestors. And then this one shows celebration in, now I'm trying to remember because I haven't watched it since last year, but I believe it was in Los Angeles at a cemetery. That's a new development, as we'll see as we go along today. There we are. So before we jump into a history of Dia de los Muertos and thinking about how it shows us syncretism, hybridity, transculturation, we want to think about cultural appropriation and how we can be sensitive to cultural traditions as we study them. So especially for me, I mean, I'm obviously not of Latin American heritage myself from my family origins. And so this is a question that I think is really important. I have this, it's an Instagram from Thor, Chris Helmsworth, who had an incident in which he portrayed the Lone Ranger for a New Year's Eve party, and he kind of was called out on participating in cultural appropriation. And so, and I should say, he wasn't dressed as Lone Ranger. He was at a Lone Ranger themed party, and he dressed as a Native person, but did it in sort of a stereotypical kind of fashion, just kind of making light and having fun with it. And so this was his sort of way of going and standing with the people at Standing Rock to show that he'd recognized the mistake and that he wanted to support the First Peoples in that particular struggle that was going on last year. There are a lot of ways in which people might dress up and use culture as a costume. You may have seen a hashtag or a slogan, "I'm a culture, not a costume." You may also think people have become overly sensitive about the issue of cultural appropriation. Maybe. And over the next few slides, there are links to a variety of different articles that you can read that sort of argue both sides of the cultural appropriation issue. But I think a quote from one of them is important. I'm going to read that here. Says, "It's rough knowing that your ancestors died and were called savages for their practices and rituals, only to become a token." The legacy of colonialism kind of adds extra baggage to this issue of cultural appropriation. These traditions that we're talking about, Dia de los Muertos, honoring the dead, through the practices that we'll outline in a few minutes, were belittled for generations and centuries. And so now for them to become this sort of plaything for people, or to sort of just have a costume, can really hurt. However, I think there are other ways of participating with cultural traditions that can be sensitive, that aren't just appropriating someone else's culture, but that are trying to say, look, I understand, and we can see the value of this. And usually that involves participating in celebrations for things like Dia de los Muertos that people who are of Mexican heritage are actually participating in, being invited in, doing things the way that they're doing it. Here locally, this is sort of like being invited to a feast day at one of the pueblos. You need to be invited. You need to go and respect the traditions that are going on there. It's not something that you kind of go off and do on your own and replicate. And I think that's one way, I guess, of looking at the fine line between kind of poking fun at and making light of cultural traditions and honoring them. And you can read the quote here. Each of these images have links to articles, the history of the Dia de los Muertos and why you shouldn't appropriate it, is where the quote that I just read also comes from. And so we can get a sense of why people would be upset by cultural appropriation. We also should think about the reality, though, that cultures mix, that there isn't really a fine line around what comprises a culture, and that those things change over time. So let's talk about the Mesoamerican origins of Dia de los Muertos prior to the arrival of Europeans, and how those traditions were adapted and adopted and changed over time to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. So typically, this tradition is traced to the Aztec Empire, the Mexica people, though most Mesoamerican peoples, and Mesoamerica includes all of what is today Mexico and Central America, also honored their dead with similar harvest time traditions. These pictorial representations come from one of the many codices that were created actually after the conquest to continue the tradition of pictorial writing, um, and to preserve certain historical stories from prior to the conquest. But they're always done with a Spanish priest usually looking over the shoulder of whoever was creating these things. They do give us a good glimpse, though, again, at traditions like this one. Here are more images from the Mesoamerican origins of Dia de los Muertos. This is a skull rack, which it was a hallmark of many of the Aztec temples that you can go and visit in Mexico today. Remember that human sacrifice was part of the tradition, but not in a kind of life-taking, murderous sort of way, but in thinking about the relationship between human blood and the supernatural, and seeing humans' place in the cosmos as one of many life forms, not necessarily the dominant one, not necessarily the most important one. And so sacrifices needed to be made in order to help the world continue, to not just appease the gods, but also provide the fertility and the life-giving essence that was needed for that. So sugar skulls, or painted skulls, have become part of Dia de los Muertos observances and traditions. These are to show that people do not fear death, that they see it as part of the cycle of life, that it's something to even be embraced. And so that's why these skulls are decorative in the ways that they are. Again, it's to take something that can be seen as frightening and problematic and show that, no, that's not actually what it is for us. This quote here comes from Nezahualcóyotl, who was poet, a poet king, I guess, or emperor prior to the Spanish arrival in central Mexico. He has a reputation for his wisdom, for leaving behind a lot of important ideas that help us better understand pre-colonial traditions and thought. Thinking about death, he said, and this is of course translated, but we come only to sleep, only to dream. It is not true. It is not true that we come to live on this earth. We become as spring weeds. We grow green and open the petals of our hearts. Our body is a plant in flower. It gives flowers and it dies away. I, Nezahualcóyotl, ask, does one really live with roots in this earth? Not always on this earth, only a little while here. Even jade breaks, just as gold breaks. Even the quetzal plumes fall apart. Not always on this earth, only a little while here. So again, I mean, you can take a lot out of poetry, but this gives us a sense of how people of Nezahualcóyotl's time in the 1300s in central Mexico thought about life and death and their relationship to each other, and human life's relationship to other forms of life. In terms of the kind of cosmological traditions that surround El Dia de los Muertos, from the Aztec story of how the world came to be, there is a tradition that Quetzalcoatl, who is represented over here on this side and on this side of these two images as a plumed serpent, had a struggle with Mictlantecutli. And I probably didn't pronounce that quite right, Mictlantecutli. But Mictlantecutli was the ruler of the underworld, which was known as Mictlan. And there he kept the bones of people who had died. Aztecs and people of this Mesoamerican religious tradition believed death was part of a larger life cycle, and they believed that warriors and mothers who had died in childbirth, in particular, would attain the highest level of heaven, to put it in a way that the Judeo-Christian tradition would probably interpret it. Most other people, though, went to Mictlan, the underworld. It wasn't like a punishment for your sins. It was just, that's where you went. It wasn't a frightening place to go. It was something to be celebrated. But there is, again, this story of creating the next world, of which the Mish text, or not the Mish text, but the Mexica or the Aztecs ruled. In order to create that world, Quetzalcoatl had to go and put blood on the bones that were housed in Mictlan and give them life. And he had to secretly do that before he was caught by Mictlantecutli. So it was Quetzalcoatl that gave life to the Aztec people in this tradition. But of course, death was still part of what would come as the life cycle was processed and continued. During Aztec times, the Day of the Dead was a harvest celebration. So thinking about harvesting crops, seeing the fruit of the field come to fruition was also a time when people kind of turned their thoughts to the dead, to the afterlife. And this was usually near the beginning of fall. So flowers, chrysanthemums, and orange marigolds, and you can see the Nahuatl, or the Aztec word for that, were brought out to celebrate ancestors and family members who had gone on before. Feasts and dances marked these celebrations. These were seen, again, not as macabre or sad times, but as times in which people could make connections to those who had gone before them, and even a time when those people, their spirits, could return, usually to the dwellings that they had lived in while they were alive. So the family home, for example, would be a site where ofrendas, such as, this is a modern one, of course, but such as this one, would be put out, meals would be held, the flowers would be there, tamales, traditional drinks, would be served. Even then, things like pulque or early versions of mezcal would be consumed. Today, tequila, beer, atole, to, again, honor the return of the spirits of those that had gone before, to make that connection, to remember them, and to remember what those people who had gone on before signify for us, the living, was the idea here. So that is sort of, what the holiday was all about in a nutshell. After the conquest occurred, and here we have Hernan Cortés, and a sketch of Catholic priests who were missionaries to indigenous people. After the conquest occurred, Spanish Catholic traditions were overlaid on top of existing Aztec and indigenous traditions. The priests actually liked this form. This was religious syncretism kind of at its clearest. They promoted syncretism. They liked the idea, for example, that Tonantzin, who is depicted here, who was the moon goddess in Aztec ritual, that many people in central Mexico associated her with the Virgin of Guadalupe, who was a Mexican manifestation of the Virgin Mary, of course. The priests encouraged this kind of association because they felt that it helped people convert, essentially. So they also liked the association between los Días de los Muertos, the traditions that I was just talking about at the end of the harvest, with All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which were usually held on November 1st and 2nd in Catholic tradition. All Saints' Day was November 1st, All Souls' Day, November 2nd. These holidays had actually already gone through their own kind of forms of local folk changes and alterations back in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. So even there, the institutional church had ideas about what All Saints' Day meant, what All Souls' Day meant. Usually those things involved, again, honoring saints who had gone before, and then all who had gone before, but doing that through masses, and going to mass, going to the rituals that had been specifically set aside for that. By the 1400s, though, people in Iberia were making pilgrimages. They were visiting the graves of those that had gone before. Many of them even believed that the spirits of those who had died would return on All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. And so in cemeteries, they would have their rituals and their kind of local folk traditions around that. Those things were carried over to the Americas, where they melded with Los Días de los Muertos. Additionally, after the conquest, there were regional variations. This is just one example from Michoacán among the Purechapa people. There, they specifically set aside November 1st to honor children who had died, angelitos, who had passed on during the previous year. And then on the 2nd of November, those who were participating in the celebrations would ride on small winged boats that they called mariposas or butterflies to the island of Janitzio in the middle of the lake that you can see on the map and in that photograph, where there's a cemetery. And there they will continue their family traditions around Dia de los Muertos and welcome back the spirits of those who have gone before. Dia de los Muertos traditionally had been a local kind of family-centered event that might be shared with extended family and friends, but not something really that communities would do all together as a whole. That is until the 20th century, when Dia de los Muertos was honored by UNESCO as a cultural heritage tradition. And also, that meant that, because there was this recognition from a United Nations group, many people in Mexico and Mexican Americans, part of the Chicano movement in the United States, realized that here's an opportunity to kind of show one of these world cultural traditions to others and invite them in and also promote tourism. So here we see a photograph from a mega ofrenda at the Autonomous National University of Mexico, that's what UNAM stands for, back in 2014, and a celebration at a smaller community in Morelos in Octopec. Again, this is a kind of shift toward the realities of the world now and how this tradition is sort of shared with people outside of the cultural heritage that these things come from. In places like Puebla, El Estado de Mexico, Mexico State, and Mexico City, I called it Los Días de los Muertos instead of El Día de los Muertos, because these traditions have kind of taken on a week-long, or they've become something that happens over the course of about a week rather than something that just takes place on a day or two. So between October 28th and November 3rd, for example, on the 28th in central Mexico, people would light their first candle and set out a white flower for souls who have died, who are usually family members that they have in mind. On the 29th, they would light a second candle and dedicate a glass of water to forgotten and helpless souls. On the 30th, they light the third candle, a second glass of water, dedicate a second glass of water, and eat pan blanco, or set out pan blanco as an ofrenda to souls who died hungry or who were killed in action. On the 31st of October, the fourth candle is lit, a third glass of water is dedicated, and another pan blanco and some fruit, often an orange, is added to the ofrenda to honor great-grandparents or ancestors that you did not know in life. On the 1st of November, this is the Day of the Innocents, or Los Angelitos, children, candles, pan dulce, chocolate, honey, flowers are all set out, things that children would have liked to have eaten. On the 2nd of November, this is the Day of the Faithful Dead. Then incense, more flowers, beer, and other types of food and cigars are added to the ofrenda. On the 3rd of November comes the despedida. On that day, copal incense it's made from the resin from trees, is burned, and the last white candle is burned in order to bid farewell to the souls that had come back to visit this world during the Dia de los Muertos traditions. So again, that's just an example of how these things might take place today in Mexico. In the United States, you can see the central map here, regions where Day of the Dead is most celebrated. Of course, the Southwest and California is not surprising because of the large Mexican American populations that live in this area. and the tradition that we have of having been part of Mexico in our own history. Um, by the 1970s, these celebrations became more and more widespread across the nation due to the Chicano movement, which was a Mexican-American civil rights movement that celebrated not only a Spanish ancestry, which was something that had happened in New Mexico for quite a while, but also that celebrated a mixed heritage ancestry, meaning Chicanos celebrate both their indigenous and their Hispanic roots. They recognize that they were the descendants of both the conquerors and the conquered. And so Dia de los Muertos then became something that they publicized. This is a photograph from a parade, a Dia de los Muertos parade that took place in Los Angeles. I don't know if any of you have participated in the local Day of the Tread. It's a bike ride. It used to be a run. It's not always a run. It's always a bike ride every year. I did my first century at the Day of the Tread a couple of years ago, but many people will dress up and have marigolds in their bike baskets and do the ride. Typically, those are the people that are doing the shorter rides. Those of us that did the 100 miles didn't dress that way. At least I didn't. But again, it's just interesting to see the shape that these traditions take. If you're interested in participating in some of the community observances that are taking place in Albuquerque this year, please click either on this image, this one, or this ABQ area in yellow, and you will get information about the Muertos and Marigolds in the South Valley, which takes place every year. Also, El Campo Santo, in connection with the Etrisco Heritage Foundation, is having a celebration on the 4th. And I think actually, so I said Muertos and Marigolds, that link is here. This is a picture from Muertos and Marigolds, but the link will actually take you to the event for the National Hispanic Cultural Center's Despedida. So they do a Despedida that the whole community can come to on, I think this year it is on the 3rd. It's either the somewhere between the 2nd and the 4th, depending on what day of the week that falls on. Also, this morning I took these photographs in the atrium at the MJG building at Westside Campus. Oftentimes, instructors will put up these ofrendas that people can come along and contribute to. So you can write your memories of departed loved ones, color a skull, or create a sugar skull. Something I didn't mention about the sugar skulls, the makeup that is worn is reminiscent of course, of a skull, of a skeleton, but it also goes back to, sorry, let me find the right name. It slipped to my mind. Oh, to the Katrina. Katrina was a skeleton representation that the famed printmaker Jose Posada made in the late 19th century. And so you might call these skulls Katrinas. If you hear that, that's where that came from. It just means this style of skull representation. And again, the purpose of painting your face in that way, it's not to be scary, it's not to be spooky, it's not Halloween, but it is to show that that we as humans do not fear death, that we see it as part of a cycle, and that we are welcoming back the souls of our departed loved ones. Also, the consumption, or actually eating a sugar skull, is showing that we are willing to consume death, that it will not be something that will consume us instead, so we won't have the negative feelings that can often accompany death. So what does this all add up to in terms of helping us think about creating a new, unique culture in Latin America? There are 3 different terms that I've mentioned already that can kind of give us a sense of how to make sense of all of this. For a long time, especially from the kind of Western academic tradition that started to professionalize in the 19th century, there was this belief that the Spanish or the British or the French, whichever colonial power had come and taken control of different sections of the Americas, had, for all intents and purposes, wiped out older traditions. There was even a thought in the 19th century that that was the desirable outcome of assimilation, that these more urbane or superior, for lack of a better way of putting it, because that's what it was. These superior ways of doing things, of thinking about religion, thinking about the world around us, should overwrite those of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Of course, that's not the case. Indigenous peoples are resilient. They have preserved their cultures and their traditions in spite of those attempts to wipe them out. And in the process, that effort to preserve their traditions has created an interesting mixing of the way that they saw the world with the way that Catholics, for example, saw the world. So that example of Tonatzin and the Virgin of Guadalupe. Even though the Spanish priests and the Spanish colonists who came to Mexico and even New Mexico in the 15, 16, 1700s, they had a certain perception of what the Virgin Mary meant, of who the Virgin of Guadalupe was. And indigenous people had their own ideas about powerful women who were deities for all intents and purposes, who connected them to the supernatural. And so they understood then these Catholic symbols in ways that the Catholics themselves didn't, if that makes sense. So syncretism then is a term that has been used to describe sort of that process of how religious traditions and ways of thought have mixed together. It usually wasn't through a planned process, but it was sort of just the way it ended up. With the notion of syncretism, though, and so I'm thinking of syncretism, the term, as a concept for thinking about the past, the issue of dominance isn't really delineated in the term syncretism when people use that, when academics use that. So they're not really thinking about which traditions dominated the others and what role that has to play in the new traditions that were created. Hybridity is a term that was originally borrowed from biology and the sciences, and it's typically used to refer to cultural forms that have drawn from two or more distinct traditions. So we're creating a hybrid of the traditions that have gone on before. And that one doesn't necessarily deal with what has been wiped out, those power relations that I mentioned either. It tends to do more with cultural traditions and with religious ones. So academics tend to use syncretism when they're talking about religious intermixture, and they use hybridity when they're talking about cultural forms that they wouldn't consider particularly religious, for example. Transculturation tries to bring all of these things together and address the reality of power relations between the conquered and the conquering, to realize that there was an effort to silence and to erase the traditions of indigenous peoples, but that they resisted, and that their ideas and their notions were fused into the new cultures that developed in Latin America. So you can see there aren't hard and sharp lines between these terms, but hopefully the three of them will help us to think about the process of creating specific Latin American cultures. And of course, there's no one Latin American culture. There are different cultural forms that take place in different regions throughout all of Latin America. So in conclusion, Dia de los Muertos is a strong example of this hybrid cultural religious tradition that developed during the Spanish colonial period. Oh, and I forgot, I was going to move this so it wasn't covered by my head. I'll read it to you. The Dia de los Muertos tradition was adapted and reshaped through a process of negotiation between the conquered and the conquerors. So I think about, is this an example, or not even is it, but in what ways is this an example of transculturation? And also important, despite our discussion or analysis of what the holiday shows on a world civ level, so thinking about its place in the world as a world heritage tradition, that there were actually other places, peoples in Peru and South America. And if you look at the National Hispanic Cultural Center video, even in Egypt, who practice similar traditions, it's individual people's stories and memories of their loved ones that helps this holiday maintain its significance to Mexican and Mexican American populations here and around the world. On one of the earlier slides, something I didn't point out is that there is a link to an oral history tradition, or an oral history recollection, I should say, of one woman remembering celebrating Dia de los Muertos with her grandmother. And that's what I'm really thinking about here. So please, if you get the chance, go and read that. And think about, especially if you observe Dia de los Muertos, what it means to you and how this tradition has gotten to you and to us.